It's funny that here we are talking about utilizing technology to communicate, and I didn't do a PowerPoint, which is really uncharacteristic of me, but I was hoping to do the short and sweet thing, and I really wanted to focus more, if you look at the title, I wanted to really focus more on, we've heard the science, we've heard the great communications portion of this, and I wanted to take time and look at some of the trends of the politicizing of water as pertains to agriculture. And so I'm really glad for the opportunity, and if there's anything you guys want afterwards, come and grab me, or if you want to talk more about the California water experience, and I'll try to jump in with a little bit more with that as well. We can definitely meet up afterwards. I'll be here around. So I did have a different kind of speech prepared to discuss more in depth, water quality issues, scarcity, infrastructure, policy, market structures, all that stuff. And probably the most prepared I've ever been for anything. And then as I was getting ready to board the plane yesterday, a headline from the LA Times hit. And the title struck me. And when I read through it, it struck me even more. Now, the title is this. It's the LA Times. This is the politics section. Capital Journal. Thirsty crops should require state regulation. And the headline, like I said, kind of threw me back, but I knew I needed to read through it. And so, being from California and being a third-generation farmer in California, I always knew that the notion of government-dictated agriculture had to be a radical belief by some, but it was never spoken of. I never mentioned it because I thought I would sound like the Tin Hat crew. And, who would go down that rabbit hole, and who would be that conspiracy theorist? So after reading the piece and kind of being assaulted by one-liners like Sacramento should tell farmers how to use water and what they can and cannot plant and irrigate, or that the solution to California's drought is crop regulation, I actually found myself with a very different reaction than I think my father would have had. I was glad. I was actually very glad. Because to me, it's finally out there. The big bad monster under the bed is out there. The unspeakable, crazy notion is legitimately being advocated for. And now I don't sound crazy when I come here and tell you that the 21st century American water wars have nothing to do with water. The actual challenges facing agricultural water use in the battlefields, I would say, are scarcity, obviously, growing and changing demands on surface and groundwater supplies, not just among agricultural water users, but urban, municipal, and environmental water users, has resulted in the resources' overall accessibility, issues of infrastructure, issues of conveyance and things like that, both on the macro level and on the regional level. We see that all the time, scarcity. Quality being the other major hallmark, right? And I know that that's something that the animal agricultural community cares deeply about and is often scrutinized for is impacts of agricultural water applications and practices that are constantly under scrutiny for their impact on groundwater and surface water quality. Just a side note, my great-grandfather came to this country and was a dairy farmer. My father, on the other hand, felt like it was a prereq to like cows, and he does not. And so we ended up in row crops and permanent crops. So that's kind of my random connection to animal agriculture there. And finally, value. The crop per drop conversation. Is agricultural use of the resource reasonable and beneficial use at all? But I would say that the root challenge to the ongoing debates in each of these arenas is actually the societal shift from an agrarian society, an agrarian majority, to a consumer majority. That the new relationship between the reactive agrarian minority and the susceptible consumer majority increasingly determines the outcomes of new water policies, whether we're talking about support for large infrastructure development or opposition for large infrastructure development, groundwater quality policy, or, as in the case of the LA Times, the true value and benefit of farm water use. So to understand this relationship, kind of piggybacking off of this last speaker, let's look at who the parties are in this relationship. The modern American consumer is about 4 to 6 generations removed from the farm and their food supply. The modern consumer is mobile, communication-centric, increasingly diverse, and information-driven. They're an advocate. They are advocate in nature and seek the sense of, and seek that sense of advocacy in their participation and in their purchases. So most importantly, the consumer today is highly motivated by the opportunity highly motivated by their opportunity for their purchase power to have benefit beyond the product itself. According to TrendWatch, the modern consumer seeks authenticity and results and wants to see the ethical credentials of the companies and organizations and brands that it chooses to interact with. Increasingly sensitive social responsibility in their consumer behavior, according to a 2005 study published in the Journal of Business Ethics. Today's consumers are emotionally based. Consumers don't change willingly, but must be and are constantly convinced on an emotional grounds to change their behavior, to make purchases, and as such, they're more likely to support, oppose, or demand specific policies, criteria, or regulations on industries from which they consume. That was a lot to intake. So that's kind of essentially what the last speaker was saying, kind of updating it for, who are they and what motivates them. Really, the bottom line out of that is they're emotionally driven and they don't change willingly. Human behavior is we don't change, right? We don't change willingly. We don't like it. Now, on the other hand, we have the minority. The American agriculture is in this reactive position now. And for the first time in human history, farmers are having to explain their role in society and justify what they do. Think about that. Human existence. This is the first time agriculture is actually having to say, I'm important and here's why. Yeah. Now Twitter's buzzing. Who's on Twitter in the back? Keep tweeting me over here. Okay. According to the EPA, practicing agriculture makes up less than 1% of the population. This is all something you guys already know. Since the 1940s, 25% of the population was in agriculture. Now we're looking at less than 1% that produces 2.6 times as much product to keep up with domestic demand in global markets, resulting in the United States becoming the largest net exporter. Developing new technologies and mechanization based on rapidly evolving science. Modern agriculture is seeking efficiency. I always emphasize to people that a farmer will not do more than what they absolutely have to do, because it's just not economically viable when you consider the amount of work that goes into it, when you consider the amount of cost that goes into it. To keep up with demand and changing social priority. I think the modern American farmer is the great adapter. I am always stunned at how our industry so rapidly adapts, so quickly responds to the market, so quickly changes to the regulatory mandates and to various social priorities as well. But this isn't a versus relationship, if I were to reference the last comment from the last section. Actually, this relationship is a love triangle, a bit of a ménage à trois, if you will. Agriculture's fight isn't with the consumer, but for the consumer's affections. Agriculture's fight isn't with the consumer, but for their support, their attention, and their favor. The consumer's other lover is the third-party advocacy organization, the rise of the third-party advocacy group, which I think you've seen even more powerful and even more influential thanks to the media and socially driven technology age that we live in. These organizations market to and communicate with the consumer in their own emotional language, appealing to their need for positive social contribution. Policy interest groups activate consumers to flex their purchasing power and to share their advocate voice to demand government policies and criteria placed on agriculture and other natural resources. The cycle of proposed regulatory policy, ginned-up public support, political popularity and priority, implementation isn't new, but it's amplified again by this social information age that we're in. But this notion that it takes regulation to mandate, it takes regulation or a mandate to change agricultural practices is based on a dangerously ignorant myth held by the majority that agriculture will never do its job correctly, morally, efficiently, or consciously. So to correct agriculture's ways, to bring it into the modern age, to change and control the culture and practices of agriculture, increased public attention and demand is given to regulate the resources on which farming depends for our own good. We don't know what we're doing. The regulation of water will be the single most influential factor on the future of agriculture, private property, consumer choice, food access, health equity, economic and national security. The unintended consequences of agriculture's constant compliance is the abdication of our power and influence in the battle for the hearts and minds of the consumer. Sadly, agriculture has been a neglectful lover, mistaking the consumer's need for food, fiber, and fuel for affection and assumed understanding. Caught in the crosshairs aren't just the family farms or the related industries, but the millions of poor and working class consumers who cannot afford the special interest brand of social consciousness, but live paycheck to paycheck, seeking the healthiest life they can afford. To give you guys some reference, we're looking at 800,000 acres fallowed in California this year. We already have had an average of 40% unemployment in the large agricultural counties of the state as a result of mismanaged water, as well as natural drought for the past 5 to 7 years. But then you start looking at CNBC is predicting a 25% increase in the average food costs this year. You look at the consumers in Southern California who also are looking at an increase in their utility rates because we are down power on the grid, literally, because there's no hydropower. So you're looking at this massive increase in cost of living, as well as a mandate that gets handed down through whatever regulation we as an industry are responding to. And those are the people that get caught in the crosshairs. The everyday mom, of 2.5 kids, trying to give her kid a healthy life, who can't afford it. So the future of American agriculture depends on water availability, and water availability depends on being an advocate. How does agriculture go from a reactive position to a proactive position? I get asked this constantly. And the answer is incredibly simple in my mind, and as such, it's incredibly difficult, which is just do it. Sounds really horrible to say that, but it's more along the lines of, and I'm at risk of sounding like I'm contradicting the last speaker, but I'm going to try to navigate this correctly. I say don't react, but what I'm really saying is say what you want to say. Say it clearly. Say it with confidence. Don't be detracted when, asked, when did you stop poisoning my kid? Which I literally have been in meetings where that was asked of me. Stay to the point. Stay true. Stay constant. Stay to your point. And defend the industry. And maybe defense is the wrong way, but represent the industry with confidence. And I'll get to that in a minute. As leaders of our community, it's up to us to navigate this new reality, this cycle of public opinion and the importance of public opinion in the process. And we should never, I'm not a big fan of reinventing the wheel. There's a reason why the consumers are responding to messaging points from others and from those that we maybe haven't met with, for those that we may never get along with, and from those that we just haven't talked to. And it's because this cycle works so well, and because the information age has worked, and they've harnessed the language of the consumer. And so that goes to my second point, which is to communicate. It's time for agriculture to take flowers to the consumer. It's time to tell her in her love language, and to talk sweet to her, and to speak to her with authenticity, to speak to her with confidence, and gratitude, and persistence. And trust me, women like that. Embracing technology and public priorities. As an industry, we must get ahead of the mandates and regulations, embracing and pioneering water use technology wherever beneficial, and we should brag about it. Whenever we do something right, we need to tell the world. I think where we run into a problem, I always go back to the coffee shop, right? My dad goes to the coffee shop every morning, and I call it the Broken Hearts Club because I can't stand going there because something is always wrong and bad and negative. And the other thing I realized when I go to the coffee shop is everybody's talking and no one is saying anything. And it's this interesting collective agreement that I really do care about you, neighbor, but I really don't want you to know a lot about what I'm doing, and I really don't want to know a lot about what you're doing, and it's okay, I respect that. It's okay. No, I don't need to know your business. No way. And I think that we have this apprehension about communicating to our consumer in that way, that they're going to get overwhelmed, it's stuff they don't understand, and they're going to take it out of context, because we've seen it happen before. Guess what? If we talk to the consumer in their language, they won't do that, because they're not going to dig into the weeds. The majority of the consumer public, the consumer voters, by the way, and this is why they're important and why we have to communicate to them in that regard, is they're not going to dive into the chemical molecular level. They're going to believe what they're told or what they're reading or how much that's reinforced with them. And can it be cited and credible? And is it authentic? And is it, is it authentic? And can it be cited and credible? And is it correct? Is it correct? Is it moral? Those are how we need to filter our messaging in terms of how much we give up, how much we're allowing the consumer to see. And it's not saying that the information shouldn't be there, because if the consumer wants to dive in and jump into that, be my guest. I'm a big fan of that. But in terms of our proactively communicating with the consumer, we have to tell them what we want them to know. And we have to speak to it with confidence, and we have to speak to it that we know what we're doing. Damn it. We know how to do what we do, and we are the best at what we do, because I firmly believe that, and I don't think anybody in here doesn't.